Welcome back to another episode of The State of Sustainability. I'm your host, Saif Hameed, founder and CEO of Altruistic. In this episode, we speak with David Croft. David has recently stepped down from his role at Reckitt, maker of Dettol, Nurofen, and Durex, where he was leading their sustainability function, having had a long career in this space, spanning a wide range of organizations. He's had sustainability leadership roles at Diageo, Waitrose, Cadbury's, some of the real trailblazers in this space. This was a super fun conversation where we touch on a wide range of topics centered around the increasing focus on resilience. We talk about what resilience means for business and for sustainability professionals on the road ahead. David, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to have you with us.
Nice to speak to you. Nice to see you again, actually, yes.
You have a wealth of experience across a range of interesting organizations that have been doing impactful work for decades now, actually. And I thought that the best way to bring this through would be to talk about two themes. One is this mythical triple win, and I'll describe what I mean in a moment. And the second is just how the sustainability profession has developed over the time that you've been part of it. The way that I define a triple win in a sustainability context is where it's a win for the supplier, it's a win for the business, and it's a win for the planet. And I think that you could probably add on another win and say there's a customer as well. You could make it a quadra or a tetra win as well. But the reason that I talk about triple win is because I think we're increasingly recognizing in the sustainability space that the value that you bring to the ecosystem is just as important as the value you bring to the business. And I know that that's been quite a core part of how you have seen your role and your responsibility, not just at Reckitt, but more generally. Could I just hand it over to you, maybe to just tell me a little bit about how you see win-win-win playing out?
Yeah, I think you have to find multiple value points, both for your own organization, but also beyond. I mean, it makes no sense to me to have an unsustainable system economically, environmentally, socially, for any of the actors involved. And that usually means that everybody has to compromise a little bit, so that the whole eventually is greater than the sum of the parts. There's no point in, screwing down a supplier's price if in the long term that supplier then becomes less effective, less resilient, less delivering on quality, compromising perhaps on many, many things from an environmental or social perspective, the sort of things that actually we've seen an awful lot of over the last 30 years. It makes no sense to me to run a supply network only for the benefit of one entity in that supply network. And so if you want to build resilience, I think you have to build, A, that compromise, and B, multiple value opportunities for different actors on the line. And that also has to include the wider ecosystem that it's part of. And we talk about that from an environmental perspective because we see ongoing challenges to natural resources. We see impacts from things like climate change and so on and so forth. But there's also a social impact, the communities that are parts of the landscapes that we within that global value chain are also part of. The best example are things like water. If you're abstracting water, then that has an impact way beyond your own immediate use of it. For me, it makes absolute sense to put consideration back into the landscape where you take that water from to try and build resilience. And that resilience is not just for my benefit, for my supply chain's benefit, or my supplier's benefit. It's also for the communities within that ecosystem, that landscape. It's for nature within that landscape, all of which are part of the increasingly visible, interdependent elements of that ecosystem that we're all dependent upon. Now, if we think about the economic aspects of things, which is really where I think your question was started from, making things work with suppliers, particularly when I think about primary producers, is really critical. If a primary producer, a farmer, isn't surviving economically, then whatever we're buying from them is not resilient in its supply network. And so over many occasions, over the past 20, 30 years now, I've spent time with farmers and in farming communities, really trying to understand what their challenges are and how we could work together to strengthen the supply network to benefit them, but in doing so, to also benefit my network and ultimately my businesses, and also the customers that we serve. Fair trade in cocoa, for example, working with thousands, literally thousands of smallholder farmers in West Africa to improve their productivity, which meant their income was higher, our supply network was more resilient, our dependency on the location meant that it was worthwhile investing disproportionately, perhaps, compared to others, but to make certain that we had the right quality, quantity, and at a cost that remained affordable within the whole economic structure of the chocolate bar supply network. Because, as we've seen in the last couple of years, when cocoa prices start to get above $8,000, $10,000 a tonne, then people start buying less chocolate. And that means the ROI for the significant investment that big chocolate companies make on millions of pounds worth of production lines just doesn't stack up for them or their investors. You need to work with the farmers to support productivity, which means more money in their pocket, a more resilient supply chain to us. And increasingly, it also means they can farm in a way that maybe also looks after nature in a different way, that is not as dependent upon intensive chemistry, which they may never have access to in the first instance because it's too expensive. But fundamentally, it puts more money into their pocket. In the case of cocoa farming, it means kids are going to school. It means the supply chain is more resilient. And ultimately, the whole system works more effectively. But in order to do that, you have to see it end to end, as opposed to your small part of it and only seeing that on a spreadsheet that exists on your laptop.
David, I want to go a little deeper into resilience as a business advantage. And what I'm going to say next may sound a little provocative to some of our sustainability professional listeners, but I would say if you look at the volatility of prices of key commodities over the last several years, that volatility is all over the place. And I would expect that, and by all over the place, I mean things 150, 200 days of volatile prices for key commodities in a given year. And I would argue that that volatility is only likely to increase as we continue to breach key planetary boundaries to a greater degree. And so I would sort of suggest that you could have resilience or you could have agility. And I think that to some extent, both of them can go hand in hand, and to some extent, they might be conflicting. For instance, a resilient procurement strategy might involve more vertical collaboration, as you say, more engagement, working more closely with certain suppliers, making investments for the long term to increase their resilience against that volatility. On the other hand, an agile procurement strategy might say, I need to be able to procure from whoever is able to meet my demand needs whenever they do so, which means that I need to be able to play across the whole global supply network, and therefore not actually invest too deeply in any one supplier. Would you say that these are opposing forces? They can work hand in hand? Why would you go for resilience versus agility?
I think it depends on the strategic nature of the material that you're talking about. If you have a strategic reliance upon something, then yes, you could chop and change on a frequent basis. But in doing so, and I've seen this numerous times in the past, from manufacturing suppliers through to raw materials from an agricultural origin or even extractive, if you chop and change, you don't build up any great understanding of what's going on at the base of that supply chain. And ultimately, the pressures that we're starting to see on all of those supply networks, at whatever level of the supply network, whether it's economic, environmental, you name it, means that if your game is to chop and change across multiple suppliers, I think almost inevitably the price is going up and the span of opportunity is getting narrower. For me, that's why it makes sense, not necessarily for everything, but for the real key strategic materials, is to think more vertically engaged and to work to build resilience into not just one, but let's say 2 or 3 locations, suppliers, whatever way you want to describe it. Nobody wants to get into single sourcing because then that is a risk in a different direction. But if we think about where agricultural supplies are coming from, they're increasingly impacted by a range of environmental and particularly biodiversity and nature impacts. We're all dependent on that for everything that we have. I mean, I'm looking around my house today and thinking, where's supper coming from tonight? Well, actually, if I can't get the food that I'm reliant upon from local sources, then can I get it imported? Which supermarket do I get? The same questions are made. Supermarkets will ship things around the world in order to maintain supply for us. But increasingly, that's getting harder and harder because the origins aren't there. The costs of doing so are growing. There are political imperatives that prevent it. And so we have to either accept that we're not going to get everything all of the time, or we need to make different choices. Now, as a procurement organisation, you're in a position where you can make those choices and you can invest and work with certain key suppliers to build that strategic resilience, which then underpins your business. I'm not advocating going back to vertical integration, where companies at one end of the supply network own farming activity. To be honest, most of those companies who had that in the past sold it off in the 90s and the noughties, and frankly don't necessarily even have the organisational skill set to run that type of supply network any longer. Equally, there are an awful lot of those, what we would have termed commodity supply chains, that are based on millions, literally millions of smallholder farmers. And so trying to own land where all those smallholder farmers might be tenants and farming for you just doesn't make any sense. But there are new ways of working with even those millions of smallholder farmers through farmer infrastructure, building co-ops, rewarding farmers for the quality, consistency, and ongoing delivery, not just of the product, but perhaps even more, rewarding them for how they farm, not just the productive element of how they farm. And I think going forward, that creates multiple opportunities for resilience. Resilience in the supply of the material, underpinned by resilience of the local landscape, which benefits continuous supply, but adds actually extra benefit to the farmer, but also to perhaps myself as the customer. At some point, I'd be buying carbon credits. Is it not more effective to pay the farmer of that key raw material to farm in a certain way, to sequester that carbon that I will then use as well? I'm creating a more virtuous circle by doing that. And so for me, resilience goes beyond the simple, consistent supply of the product. It's how you then start to add additional value points that are beneficial to different actors along the chain, but create opportunity through that virtuous cycle that I was trying to describe.
And David, there are 2 aspects to this virtual cycle that I'm hearing from you. One is the investment in the ecosystem. And I kind of think, for instance, this is, almost like if you think of Ghanaian cocoa, this is the Ghanaian cocoa ecosystem, for example. And the second piece is the investment in the individual supplier in terms of making that supplier financially and economically survivable. And I think that for many primary producers, that's an increasingly important area. We touched a little on latex, but I remember that when you and I last spoke, there was a really amazing set of insights that you'd gathered and acted upon in the context of latex for Reckitt, where you sort of brought both of these elements into action. Could you describe that for our listeners? Like, what was the problem statement? What was the finding? What was the initiative? This podcast is brought to you by Altruistic. Sustainability teams have one thing in common. They all have messy data sitting in silos across the business. This means 60% or more of their time is spent getting data into shape and not making sense of that data or using it to drive action. Altruistic's AI-based tools can help. Meet Evie, your in-house, always-on-call sustainability assistant. Evie works alongside you and your teams to clean up and transform your enterprise data into usable emissions calculations. Even better, Evie helps you interrogate this data, working like the junior analyst you wish you had. AI alone won't solve all your problems, but data transformation is one you can cross off your list. Visit altruistic.com to find out more. That's altruistic with a Q.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's unique to Reckitt. I've seen it on multiple occasions. But, the starting point is, do you have consistency of supply? What is the pressure you face, particularly on agricultural type commodities, that is increasingly visible because land use change is continuing and growing at pace? The ability of that land to support productive outputs is getting tougher because of impacts on nature, possibly climate change, but maybe water stress, soil health, a whole range of things. Thirdly, as a result, people who own that land are considering what's the crop that they want to grow on it? What's the highest value crop that they want to grow on it? Well, if that's not the thing that you want to buy, then you've got a threat to the origins that perhaps you've relied upon for a century or more in some cases. We're seeing that happen consistently. Latex was part of that discussion. By moving supply, by shifting, we reduced one of those risks of land use change. We also invested in the farming activity, helping farmers to strengthen the quality that they were delivering. And that meant consistency of latex coming through at the high quality that was needed. But it also meant that the approach to farming also meant higher productivity and created the potential for adding both a nature resilience in terms of preserving, strengthening biodiversity at a time when frameworks such as TNFD are asking people to consider nature literally on the balance sheet and think of the dependency and the impacts that you have, and then think through, well, how can you support that at a point of origin so that you have consistent and resilient business growth potential going forward? Because if you haven't got that, then there's a challenge to your business growth and performance. In doing so, you can also think about how you can create carbon opportunities. Because again, the way you can farm, perhaps using charcoal as a soil health improver, perhaps planting around the farm, perhaps thinking about different hedging opportunities and so on and so forth, can add carbon opportunity that the farmer then creates that you can take advantage of. And so instead of buying, in that case, a kilo of latex, you're buying a kilo of latex farmed in a certain way that gives you confidence and resilience of nature that tackles your biodiversity risk. Potentially also buying carbon and reinvesting the value of that carbon to the farming community. What that does is something that I think we have to think very carefully about how we can take it to scale. Because it's fundamentally thinking about land in a different way. That the productive value of land is not just the kilo of something that it grows. It's about what that land also acts and does. Sequesters carbon, strengthens nature, preserves biodiversity, adds additional nature-based solutions. For example, helping to support and manage the water catchment, reducing pollution if you're farming in a slightly different way, or actually reducing pollution because you farm in a certain way that uses things like reed beds to take out organic or other pollutants. It could also be about helping manage the catchment area more broadly, stopping downstream floods. And that's why thinking about landscapes and resilient landscapes that we are all part of, as a business, because it's part of our supply network, as a business, because that's where our factory sits. We're all, but as individuals as well, we're all part of those natural landscapes. And if we can see how we interact with them and think about how we can add value to them, then you create a very different and much more resilient landscape model. And frankly, a different economic model where the value of land is much more than the one single long-standing historical financial capital outcome from it, because it's creating additional value. And that's without getting into issues such as the social impact, the human impact of land, the visual impact of land. All of those come as well. But frankly, there are emerging markets already for carbon and nature credits, and they're the things that we can work to first in terms of how we think about the landscapes that we are part of, and particularly the landscapes that our value chains are dependent upon.
And David, I want to dive into a couple of areas on this. One is we're talking about an exchange of value. There's not just the latex coming one way, but there's also resources going back to the producer to ensure that the land is preserved and managed in a way aligned with nature. Is the market-based mechanism here that we're looking at, is it an offset? Is it an inset? I know there's a religion now around these things, but what is the actual token? And then I'd love to follow that on with a couple of questions around how you make the case internally. But let's start with what kind of token are we talking about here?
It is an inset if you're already part of that value chain. But there are other potential values that are accrued by others that are dependent upon or impacted through that landscape. So let's forget about latex. Let's think about it from a Northern Hemisphere perspective. Downstream flood risks are an increasing part of what we see in Western Europe, in the UK, in the US. Heavy rains, which are becoming more and more commonplace because of climate change, and are leading to saturated water tables at certain times of the year, downstream flooding, which is causing massive impact on cities, and therefore massive economic impact. It may not close a factory, but it might mean you can't get to the factory to work in it. Thinking about the landscape and the catchment that location is part of leads you to think upstream. And that's where land management, farmland, can add value to the people who are living in that city, to the insurance companies who are paying out for that risk. That market is still emerging because it is a very diverse market, but it is certainly an area of opportunity where nature-based solutions upstream can reduce downstream flood risk, can add value for the landowner upstream, and particularly if it's moorland, it has very limited existing economic land value. Perhaps sheep farming doesn't make people a lot of money these days, I have to say. So planting some trees, I don't say reforest the whole country, but planting some trees sequesters some carbon and helps to manage the downstream flood risk. There are growing examples of this throughout the world, but I've seen a number of them in Western Europe. The challenge is that the market is still diverse. The insurance companies could play a part in stimulating that, but think of the way we're trying to engineer flood management otherwise. We're building concrete walls. We're saying you can't afford to live there because your insurance risk is going to be too high for the house. So we're making technological changes downstream when perhaps we should be thinking about nature-based solutions upstream that have bigger, long-term, and equally impactful results. It just takes a little bit longer and a little bit thinking outside the box that we all live in to consider the landscape that we're part of.
And David, when you need to make the case to your finance colleagues for, let's say, spending more with a certain part of the supply chain than might need to be done on a simply here and now basis, is the case made on the angle of saying, look, from a resilience perspective, this investment is going to de-risk us in the future and de-risk disruption in the future? Or is it maybe just two separate budgets where you say there's a budget for offsets that we might need to spend because we can't meet our climate commitments, and we're able to tap into that budget and divert that towards existing suppliers, which is a win-win in other ways? How do you make this case?
It can be both. Typically, I would say that the resilience of certain key strategic supplies is one of the most motivating start points. Most large organisations, when you look through their risk registers, will look at sourcing of key raw materials. The procurement teams spend most of their time thinking about how do they get that at best value over a reasonable period of time. Where we see the economic impacts of that becoming more and more challenging, then it is easier to make the case for investing in key supply networks to build resilience amongst them. If then you can say, but we're also already going to be investing or are investing in carbon, for example, or in the future we might be buying biodiversity credits. More often than not, when I've raised it, there is a huge appetite for focusing the investment on key origins. And so you maximize the investment that you make by doubling down. One, because you're buying the material from there. Two, because you're investing in that to give stronger supply networks. Three, you're further investing in it if you're returning cash in other ways through carbon or biodiversity benefits that have a net benefit, of course, to me as a customer, because I have targets to hit, I have risks to mitigate that investors expect to see mitigating actions on. It makes more sense, and frankly, I've never had any pushback when we've said resilient supply and it's more sustainable and it benefits us because of these extra value points. In fact, when you add those extra value points in, it makes the ROI for doing the work even easier to support. Oftentimes, if you think about these in three separate silos, the individual ROI may not work. If you think in silo budgets, the individual ROI for each of them might not work today. But when you group it together, and particularly when you talk to people in the business, the exco, who are supposed to and do have strategic overview, then you rise above those silo budgeting approaches that we all have. I'm deliberately not saying silo management because it's a really dirty word in organizations, but silo budgeting has exactly the same impact. You have to rise above silo budgeting and silo management to see the bigger picture. And then at a strategic level, the ROI absolutely makes sense and you get the sign off.
I think something that's really helped with this, David, is I've noticed senior procurement leaders have really developed in this direction over the last several years. Like if you look at the quality of engagement, insight, and storytelling that a chief procurement officer at a major consumer goods business has today, it's unrecognizable versus what you might have seen even 6-7 years ago, I would say. And there's a number of great examples. But I'd like to actually move towards the sustainability leader role. And you have been in this space for a while across different organizations and have had the benefit of seeing sustainability leadership roles evolve a huge deal since the first one you walked into at Cadbury's years ago over to the one that you've recently stepped down from at Reckitt. What would you say are the big shifts that you've seen in the nature of the role? What was expected of a sustainability leader when you first joined the profession, and what do you think is expected now?
Well, I think your first point about the procurement teams deserves a comment as well, because I think you're absolutely spot on. The role of procurement has evolved because where they could mine efficiencies, where they could use pressure in the relationships, those days are running out of steam. That wave has been surfed. Now, to get more value, you really have to understand the nature of that supply network, the pressures that suppliers face at every aspect of that. And the best procurement people understand that and then work with it. Now, you could say that's applying the frame of sustainability, the externalities that sustainability is grounded upon, I think, into a procurement type of activity. And for me, that's part of the step change that is going on for sustainability professionals. In the past, if I went back 20, 30 years ago, sustainability people knew about things that nobody else in the business knew about. And it was the new coming thing. And it was about perhaps human rights, perhaps it was about climate change, perhaps it was about nature dependency or resiliency and nature impacts. And they were trying to make a case inside a business for the business to tackle that and be more effective as a result. What they weren't necessarily doing is thinking about the business value that was going to be created and how to create business value. And for me, the step change is that sustainability is about really thinking and navigating all of the externalities that have always been with us in business, but only recently have become more and more visible and impactful on business performance. And so if you don't, as a sustainability person, understand how it affects business performance, and therefore the levers you need to pull to create a different business value set from it, and how to have that conversation in a language of business value or brand value, then you're not going to succeed in managing effectively the embedding of sustainability in the business. Now, this is different from the compliance agenda. This is different from doing the reporting. That clearly has to be done. But good businesses were already identifying the KPIs, identifying the material issues, reporting on their performance around them. There's just now a clearer, stronger, more effective platform of reporting that brings that together. But fundamentally, sustainability only succeeds if it embeds itself in a business, just like everything else that has happened in the past. I don't know whether you've heard of the Bradley curve. The Bradley curve was invented by DuPont probably about 40 years ago now, about people safety. And at the time, there were lots of workplace accidents. And the Bradley curve talks about shifting from an unmanaged to a compliance level, to an independent level where we all look after our own safety. In other words, I remember to put my hard hat on before I go into the room, to an interdependent level where I wouldn't go into the room without a hard hat on, but neither would I ever let you walk in either. Most businesses haven't got to that stage yet. Most of them are still at the compliance level, which is telling people, make certain you put your hard hat on. We need sustainability to embed itself in a similar process. So it's not the people in an organisation with the job title sustainability who do it. It's the procurement people. It's the brand people. It's the product innovators. It's the finance team who think about these externalities and embed the management and the agility around these new externalities into business processes so that the business can be effective and agile against these new challenges, and actually to embrace them and create opportunity by it. In order to do that, You don't just have to understand or have a PhD in climate change. You have to understand how that's going to affect your particular organization. And I don't just say business, but your organization. And work out how you help that organization to manage and contribute to managing climate change so that as an organization, it is a more resilient organization, so that as a business, it is a more effective business with longer term growth potential and all that comes with that. So the challenge for sustainability people is almost to forget the PhD on climate change and think about what does your MBA tell you about how you need to talk about this and work this inside the business. Because if you don't do that, you can't hope to embed it within the business and to make the business more effective around all of these subjects that we talk about.
I think,
it means
David,
changing language and changing approaches.
I think, David, that's an excellent note for us to end on. And I think the idea of taking a Bradley curve approach to sustainability within your organization and your ecosystem is also a really fine one. I'm going to steal that if it's not already out there. I was a consultant to the oil and gas industry once upon a time, which are the sins I'm working off now. And I think actually the oil and gas, if you think about how the oil and gas industry embraced health and safety, because they had, at some point a very poor record in that space. And then it's the only building where I've been told off for not holding the railing while walking down the stairs by a random person. And that is basically your Bradley curve in action, where someone stops me in an office of maybe 1,500, 2,000 people or more and says, hey, you should be holding the railing. And I remember actually every meeting used to start with a safety observation as well in one of these clients. And it's, I think, no surprise that at least, 2016, 2015, some of the most ambitious sustainability strategies that I saw were coming out of organizations like Shell, because I think they were taking the mindset that they'd applied to health and safety and trying to come up with a parallel or an equivalent agenda, which then involved role modeling, incentives and structures and so on as well. So I think there's a lot to be learned from, I would say, internal efforts that have worked in parallel spaces.
I agree. That sort of parallel learning, parallel application, I think is really key. And just as you were talking, I was thinking then about, I talked a moment ago about compliance and reporting. Yes, it's to give visibility for what's working or what's not working, what the challenges are. One could equally argue that by strengthening the way non-financial reporting works, putting it onto the same footing as financial reporting, arguably the key actor in the conversation is the CFO and the board, because it's making those non-financial risks or opportunities, and resilience is an opportunity, much more visible, and the company's management and treatment of them much more visible to the key strategic leaders in the business. And so it's not about a chief sustainability officer. I think the days for chief sustainability officers are probably numbered. It's about how the CFO sees these impacts affecting the business and then can plan alongside all of the other financial pressures to address them, to mitigate them, but most importantly, to create opportunity for them. The same is true for the brand directors. The same is certainly true for supply chain and procurement leads. Ultimately, it is a leadership conversation about a new set of increasingly visible externalities that a business, if it's going to succeed, has to understand how to manage them and how to embrace them to create greater success for itself.
Yes. Very well said, David. David, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. Really enjoyed having you here. I think we sort of started the conversation with this sort of big picture idea of the triple win. We then went deep into the weeds on resilience and what resilience means, why resilience adds value. We talked a little bit about how you make the case for resilience within an organization and how you can really unlock the potential for the business to invest in partnerships across the value chain that can be a win for nature, a win for the supply chain, and a win for the business. And then we sort of brought it all the way home to talking about the sustainability profession and what we think the sustainability profession has focused on now that it maybe was doing less of before, and how the migration from, let's say, being a PhD in climate change to being an MBA in business change has been one of the most important shifts for sustainability professionals to undergo. So such a rich conversation, David. Thank you very much on behalf of our listeners, and I'm already looking forward to our next chat.
Me too. Nice to see you again, Saif. Speak soon.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The State of Sustainability. If you like our content, please hit follow so you never miss an episode.